I'm Michael Carter, and I'm the director of the Monroe County History Club. Uh, Welcome, as usual, to my wife, Paulette, and my cousins over there. We've been at this a long time now, and it just keeps getting better. Many thanks to the American Legion, which has been our home base for over 10 years, almost 11 years now. Thanks to the wait staff. Please be generous with them. They work hard. Thanks to Cats TV as well. When they came on board in 2015, things seemed to really take off for us. Dave is our cameraman today and is most days, good for Dave. What a professional bunch they are down at Cats. They put all our programs on their channel, local channel. And in addition, I'm able to put every program they film on YouTube for all to see. Many people can't attend because of jobs or because they live far away. And this allows them to be a part of our audience. Believe me, a lot of people who are transplanted Bloomingtonians watch these from all over the country, and I know that because I hear from them frequently, and they're glad to hear it. With the help of Cats TV, the Legion, the great speakers we have, and you people out there who watch and support us, we're preserving local history here. And I hope people are able to watch these programs far into the future, maybe long after we're gone, to get an idea of what our area was like back in the day. We now have about 90 programs recorded and on YouTube. And people are still watching some of them that are years old, because I see that too. I monitor it. If you want to watch any of our past presentations, just get on YouTube and type Monroe County History Club in their search engine, and it'll pop right up. We work closely with other history-minded organizations as well. We all support each other. They're the Monroe County History Center, Public Library, IU Photo Archives, Cats TV, and others. We've done presentations on so many different subjects, and the good part is we got a lot more yet to come, I hope. I have a long list of possible future programs, and I think we'll get a lot of them done. How many new attendees today? Any new ones? If anybody wants to leave their email address with me, I can give it to George, and he'll add it to our direct mailing list. Right now, Daniel Slagle, the director of the History Center, would like to say a few words.
All right, thank you, Michael. We're excited to be here, and I just want to let everyone know that we have two different events coming up. One is coming up on December 9th. It's a Saturday from 1 p.m. until 3 p.m. over at the History Center. It is the future of news. It's a panel we have that's going to be a discussion about where digital news is going into the future. So the last several have been quite popular, and so we've set our Deckard Education Room up so people can stop by and participate. So if you have questions you want to submit beforehand to our panelists, or if you just want to come and hear what is going on, we're inviting the public to please come out and enjoy that. Again, it's on Saturday, December 9th from 1 until 3. I brought a few of our flyers, so please stop by and see us. And then also, thank you to Michael and some of the other members that helped put together this history club. Is next year, we are going to be bringing some of the photos that we have from the HT as we try to get a lot of those identified. And we'll be coming early to History Club each week, or each month. I know it's not weekly, Michael. Poor Michael, that many speakers. But each month, we'll be coming early, and we'll be bringing photographs to help with any sort of identification with that. So for anyone that shows early, or if you need an excuse to come a little early, we're happy to provide that if you're willing to look at some photos for us. And then the last thing I have is our current exhibit about breaking the news comes down on December 30th. So if you've not been out to see that, it is a fantastic exhibit. I know I'm partial to it since it's at our institution, but it truly is a great, great exhibit. For anyone that's been there to see it, you can verify that. I see a lot of heads nodding. You can step into an old dark room. You can see one of the first newspapers printed in Monroe County. There is a lot to this exhibit, so please come out and see it. After that one comes down, we're going to spend a chunk of about the first 3 weeks of January to put up our new exhibit, which is the Barns of Monroe County. So we figured this audience should be very interested in that exhibit. So make sure in January to come by. It'll be January through June when the barn exhibit is up. But if you haven't, again, I encourage you to come out and see our newspaper exhibit while it's still up through the end of the year, and Barnes is next. But I do have some flyers if you want to stop by and see me with the books over there. I'm happy to talk to you about any of that. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Daniel. And we'll have a little rundown of future events. I just found this out. I'm afraid in December we will have no program. They're having staffing problems like a lot of businesses do around the holidays, and unfortunately it's just going to have to be that way this December at any rate. So our next program will be January 30th, 2024. Dr. John Butler will give a program called Depots, Platforms, and Flag Stops, a history of railroad places in Monroe County. February 27th, which will be mark our 11th anniversary, Nan Brewer give a program on the history of the IU School of Fine Arts, Eskenazi. She's been with the Eskenazi Museum for many years. April 30th, that was in March, yeah. April 30th, Christine Friesel of the MCPL will give a program called Who's Your Character? A digital map of the 19th century in Monroe County. May 28th, Roger Robinson, who's been here before, will give a program called State Championship Teams for Monroe County High Schools, 1904 to 2014. June 25th, Kurt Sylvester, who happens to be the state president of the Indiana Genealogical Society, will give a program on some of the early settler families of Monroe County, who they were and what they brought to this county. July 30th will be a look at the history of Cats TV, who's been filming our programs for so long. They will turn 50 years old next year. So we look forward to that. August 27th, John Summerlot, another past presenter, will give a program at a look at racially restrictive property covenants in Monroe County's past, going way back. September 24th, we did the history of VHS once, Bloomington High School. I thought it only fair to give the history of University High School. So we're going to do that September 24th, yeah, by Dina Kellums of IU Archives. October 29th next year, a history of Bloomington and Monroe County by Glenda Murray, who is the official historian of our county. November 26th, I had to push back the one that was going to be here next month, and that's the one on Smithville, Indians, Pioneers, Ski-Bows, and Lake Monroe by Rosie Gersman. And, you know, I hated to move that back, but I told her there are a lot of cancellations and people being people, things have to get moved around, so I wouldn't be surprised with what we end up showing hers earlier. And she was okay with it all, so it'll all work out. Today we have a veteran presenter, Duncan Campbell, who's given, this will be his fourth, I'm sure of that, going way back to when we were young people, 7 years ago, something like that. And there's the title of his program, and I'll just let it go at that without any further ado. Here's Duncan.
Thanks, Mike. It's nice to be here again. I'm hoping that because of our, and I include myself in this, average age in the room, that if you did see my barn presentation 7 years ago, you won't remember any of it. So, and actually quite a bit of it is different, although some of it's the same. The last time I talked about Indiana barn styles and where they come from, why they're different, who originated them, which immigrant groups came through Indiana and when, and so on. And as a member of the Indiana Barn Foundation, which is a nonprofit 501c3 that we've organized about this is our 10th anniversary actually. One of my tasks is to travel Indiana and inspect the condition of barns for private owners, public owners, barn owners everywhere. So over the last several years, I really haven't counted how many barns I've seen in Indiana, but it's probably close to 100 or more. My wife goes with me. We kind of make a date of it and go all over the backwoods and front woods of Indiana looking at all different kinds of barns. And so one of the things that's led to my own understanding of barn architecture and history is how different barns become as time progresses. Let's say roughly the first settlement barns in Indiana happened in the early 1800s. It's very difficult to find a barn in Indiana prior to 1820. Okay, extant. I'm not saying there weren't any earlier than that, but if there were, they're not here anymore. And I noticed that we would see fewer and fewer of those vintage barns, but that most of what I was looking at for people were barns built in the 20th century. And I came to understand from doing more research that actually more barns were built between 1910 and 1920 in Indiana than ever were built before that. So most of the extant barns that you would see driving down the highway are likely to have been built in the 20th century, a century that all of us lived in at some point, which for me means, well, that's kind of recent. I was born in 1945, so that was only 40, 35 years before that. So those barns seem newer to me than when I was just studying the so-called vintage barn from the pre-Civil War era. The newer barns, of course, owe their style, use, architectural expression to their predecessors, the more historic barns. But what I was noticing was that there was this rather significant moment of transformation in the American barn that happens roughly from the late 1860s into the 1920s. And there's an enormous transition that happens in the way barns look, the way they're used, the way they're placed on the farm, their size, and their construction technology. And looking at it, I started to realize, like, well, what else is changing in this period of time? Well, a lot. We think of our age, our current time, as sort of the digital age. Well, the 19th century was the mechanical age. When people started to work to make work-saving devices, and we witnessed an industrial revolution that has to do with the way fuel sources are used. We get the railroad, we get the telegraph, we get all kinds of communication vehicles, resource exploitation, ways of creating power and machinery, and of course we all know what the downside of it was. We get crowded cities, we get smoky atmosphere, we get all this. But all of these effects, if you will, all these advances in their own time, are read and seen in barns. For instance, most of us forget that what we now see as the Indiana National Forest was completely clear-cut in the early 20th century. It was completely clear-cut. So everything that's there that you drive through now has grown back since 1910. Okay, it's not virgin forest. So this is not just happening in Indiana. This is happening in the Upper Peninsula. It's happening on the California redwoods and sequoias. It's happening all across the country. We are basically detimbering the entire country. Why? Because we're building more and more houses, more and more cities, more and more buildings. We're responding to the Industrial Revolution. Our population is growing. It's easy to understand why these resources were exploited to the extent that they were. Also, we had a lot of resources, and so a lot of it gets commercially, it becomes a commercial vehicle for export and so on. what that meant for barn construction was it went from hand-hewn timber frame buildings to basically going to Lowe's and buying plank resourced dimensional lumber and putting barns together. And as I went through all these Indiana barns over time, I started to see what happened to the timber frame. And what did it mean to be able to buy lumber in large quantities and build larger buildings for the agricultural community? There are some sobering facts in this history as well, that because I'm in the Indiana Barn Foundation and I advocate for the preservation of historic barns, I just want everybody to know this information. According to census material, in 1997, there were 3 million barns in the United States. And by 2007, there were 664,000. 22% of what we know was there only in 1997, which was just yesterday. In 2002, there were 30,000 barns estimated to be in Indiana, and today there are about 20,000. So we've lost 33% in a 10-year period. It gets worse. If you look at the 1920 census, there were 221,897 farms in Indiana. 94% of Indiana land mass was farmed, okay, or in farming. It might have been forest, but it was on farmland. And there were approximately 300,000 barns. So we don't actually know how many barns there were because there'd never been an accurate survey. But we know there was probably, it's easy to say there was at least one barn per farm. I've been to many farms that have 4 or 5 barns on them. And even extant barns today frequently will have more than 2. So we're just saying minimally 300,000 barns in 1900. About of the 20,000 that we think are existing today, that's only 6% of the total that we had in 1900. So every barn matters. I don't care what kind of shape it's in. So we had a presentation recently from a man who runs a company called Trillium Dale out of Illinois, and it's a barn restoration company. It's a very large company, does extensive renovations. They can do $1 million projects, they can do small projects. He told me that he has worked in or seen over 1,000 barns in his career, and he's only seen 5 that he couldn't fix. So when you look at your old barn and you think it's too far gone, you're probably wrong. And he argues that even if you can't afford to fix it, just leave it there. Because even as a remnant, it's historically significant. And you never know when the next guy comes along, he might be able to fix it, or be willing to fix it, or have the wherewithal to fix it. That's my speech for today. So I spoke earlier about immigrant travel and how immigrants into this new country brought their culture and their architecture with them. This map is a little bit deceiving. The one on the right basically shows the sort of cultural hearths that were key to the distribution of culture and cultural artifacts, what's called material artifacts across the country as immigrants and settlers moved westward. Most of those cultural hearths come out of what's called the Middle Atlantic region of southeastern Pennsylvania, Maryland, and so on. Interestingly, folklorists say that the movement of ideas, writing, intellect, education, mostly came out of the cultural hearth of New England. The movement of material culture, tables, chairs, rocking chairs, baskets, barns, houses, mostly came out of the cultural hearth of the Middle Atlantic states and the upland South. I don't completely understand why this happened, but the map on the left shows the mix of ideas and material culture coming out of these cultural hearths necessarily on the East Coast, since that's the earliest part of the country that was settled by Europeans. And you can see how complicated the mix is. And if you look at Indiana, you'll see that ideas, many, many ideas and so-called intellectual notions come out of the New England area, but there's also a strong mix coming out of the Southern and Middle Atlantic cultural hearth, some of which actually comes out through Virginia, Tennessee, and up into Southern Indiana. When you travel Indiana and look at barns, what this means is that most of the things out of the Southern cultural hearth are located and implanted into Southern Indiana, essentially south of the glacial moraine, Martinsville. And beyond and above that, most of what came out of the Middle Atlantic states, and this, for most practical purposes, this is the Pennsylvania Dutch, the German immigrant. Most of that cultural hearth occurs north of Martinsville, and for more practically north of Indianapolis. So if you want to find a Pennsylvania Dutch barn, go north. If you want to find an English 3-bay barn, go south. So, and it's true as you travel Indiana, these are the things you see. This is what's known as a crib barn. A crib in barn language means room. If you're talking about houses and you say it's a double pen, it means it's got 2 rooms. A pen is a room. In a barn, it's a crib. Don't be confused with corn crib or grain crib, or all that means is room for corn, okay? Most early barns are 1 crib. This is a really good example in Monroe County in Indian Creek Township. It's all log. It's actually built into a bank, and on the far side of it, you can go into the top area, which is used as a loft, just by going up a couple of steps. And the bottom was used as a horse stable. This is a fairly recent picture of this barn. By the way, the stripes of lattice that you see on the outside of the logs, the vertical stripping, that is remnant of the barn having horizontal siding on it. So almost all log buildings, contrary to the history of Nashville, Indiana, had wood siding over the logs. The log was the structure, and the plank siding, the clapboard, the horizontal siding was the finished surface to protect the logs from the weather, because if you don't protect the logs from the weather, they rot. Anyway, this is an interesting example because it's got vertical plank on the above and furring strips on the lower part where the siding's been removed. So the cultural hearth of American farming was composed of several buildings, including a house, which you see here, an I house with a cluster of several farm buildings around it. And the purposes of those buildings were unique. So you might have a barn that was just for a stable, you might have one that was just for storing corn, you might have one that was just for your blacksmith shop, and so on and so on. And you may have a cluster of 10 buildings on a given farm. As time goes by, these chores and storage areas and work areas can start to consolidate into one larger building. When you look at the same census that I was quoting you, the 14th US Census, and you look at the number of farms, the 221,000 farms in 1900, and then you look at the number of farm buildings, it's 226 million. Wow. Yeah. So I'm not sure I completely trust that figure. When I divide that out, it's something like 100 buildings per barn or per farm. Nevertheless, it is indicative of how many buildings there were and probably how far off we are when we think about counting barns. Everything in this photograph, except for the house, could be called a barn. The crib barn, as time goes by, transitions to a timber frame barn. And we see still in southern Indiana extant examples of larger barns, like the one in the foreground with a metal roof. And I know it's dark, so you can't really see it, but underneath that shed roof is a log wall. You can just barely see the horizontal logs. And if you look in the background, is an example of an extremely early English barn that is timber framed. So on the same farm, we have a log pen barn and a very early timber frame barn. This is the interior of the log barn. These are actually two pictures of the same section, but this is the original barn on this farm, and the later farmers, a later generation, or maybe the same generation of farmers, built a larger frame barn around the log barn and incorporated it into their barn. This is a sign for us that the barn got bigger. They started growing more crops. They probably had more children. They had more people who could work on the farm. They added acreage, and the farm grew, and the barn grew around the original barn to become a larger barn. These are just some details of a door going into one of those cribs. And the thing I like the best about it is right here. I don't know if you can see my pointer, is a wood pin hinge made by hand. That door still swings on that hinge. We think this barn was probably built in about 1820. These barns, these pen barns, crib barns grow from single crib barns to double crib barns to 4 crib barns, and they transition into more modern styles, which I'll explain as we go on. This is an example in Monroe County of a double pen barn. So this is 2 log cribs built independent of one another and then roofed over later to treat it as one building. So the structure around it and the apron walls around it make for a much larger barn, but the interior of the barn is 2 separate independent cribs. This example is another example of a single crib barn being built as the original barn on the farm and having a much larger hand-hewn timber frame barn built around it to incorporate the crib inside the barn. I love this picture because it's got a brand new tractor in it. But you can see how this transformation is happening through time, and many examples of how farmers just simply adapted the historic buildings that they had or that came to them through their families, and as their farms enlarged, used new technologies, the availability of timber and so on, to build larger, more useful barns for new purposes. The English 3-bay threshing barn comes to us from Scotland, Ireland, England. It's the first barn commonly built in the east coast of the United States. It's very common in the southern states. It's also common in New England. It was originally designed as a threshing barn, meaning that the only real purpose it was put to was to thresh wheat. And you had these two doors on the broad side of the barn, and there are 2 matching doors on the other side of the barn. And you opened those doors and drove your wagon in and dumped your wheat on a hardwood floor, where you flailed it with mechanical flails, basically just a buggy whip type device, to knock the grain off. And when the 2 doors on this side and the 2 doors on the other side were opened, the chaff would blow out. That's the reason for the design. Completely natural mechanical advantage of using the wind to help you clear the chaff from your wheat. Occasionally, these barns, the 3-bay barn would have 1 bay used as a stable for a single cow or a horse, but typically they were just grain for threshing and for storing grain. As time goes by, that barn gets bigger. This barn is post-Civil War. In the foreground, you see mechanical equipment. You can see a wagon with probably a spray tank on one side of it. When you see these wings, these addition wings on one end of a barn, it's almost always built to house mechanical devices, the new tractor or a place to store your equipment. They are occasionally built to store wagons, but generally the wagon was stored in the barn, in the proper barn itself. You also see the addition of doors on either end, sliding doors opposite the middle door, which is another way to show that the barn is now being transformed to accommodate other kinds of uses. Maybe they needed to drive through it in another location. In other words, it's not just used for threshing anymore, okay? And it's gotten larger. It still doesn't have what we would call a significant loft, because hay is cut and stacked in the field, and animals are put to pasture to feed. Hay is not being baled or brought in dry yet into barns, so there isn't really any reason to have a loft. This is a variation on English barn. These are very common in deep southern Indiana along the river, and almost all of them have been, at some point, got transformed into tobacco barns. It's actually a pretty unusual barn style. I know of 3 or 4 in that area. But they're not really commonly seen. But they are an adaptation of the English barn, where the entries and the through passage is on the broad side. This is another example of an adapted English barn. You can see how much larger it is and how much larger the door areas are. And the reason that I'm using this one is people say, how do they move barns? Well, here's how they do it. They jack them up, they put them on wooden cribs, they back a truck under them, and they drive them away. This one actually is just being raised so a basement can be built under it, and it ends up being transformed into a visitor center at the LC Nature Park in Fort Wayne. But it's a great example of how we're using today's technologies to adapt these barns. So as time goes by and agricultural practices change and barns get larger and their construction, the availability of construction materials change, we see hand-hewn barns up through the Civil War and on into the 1870s and 80s typically. After the 1880s, it's less common to see a hand-hewn barn because sawmills have now grown to have the capacity of a large enough carriage. The carriage is where you lay the log before you run it through the mill. A large enough carriage to saw large beams, tree trunks, into 6x6, 8x8, 10x10, 12x12 size beams, which you would need for a barn. And so you can now access sawn material from sawmills in order to build barns. And it's interesting because as you see barns transition through these periods, you will see the longest beams, the purlin beams in the roof and rafter system, for instance, can still be 60 to 80 feet long, single tree trunks. They're hand hewn because no sawmill can handle a piece of wood that big. But the upright posts and the braces and the siding and everything else, the rafters, are sawn because you can now go down to the sawmill, and sawmills are as common as filling stations, and buy the material that you need to build the barn. While barns are hand hewn, itinerant barn builders travel the countryside and build barns for owners who usually do the timber cutting by order, and they will get the trees ready, and then the barn builders will come in and hew all the beams for the size and shape of barn that the farmer wants, and then they'll move on, and then the farmer calls his community out and they come and raise the barn. So I've been told that a good mechanic can hew a 10-foot, 8x8 beam in about 2 hours. Okay, that's extremely fast. I can't split a quarter of a cord of firewood in anywhere near that time. So these people were extremely efficient. They could hew out a barn in a couple of weeks on site, and it could go up in a couple of days. And remember, 300,000 of these were raised in Indiana sometime in the early 20th century. So this was a very common practice that people would see daily as they drove their wagons down the highway. So what are the changes? Walls get taller, sidewalls get taller. There's an addition of entrances, sometimes single entrances, sometimes wagon entrances. Sometimes there are adjacent small buildings. Sometimes those are used for mechanical advantages. You could have a horse in there on a conveyor belt and he's walking on a platform or around a circle in order to run some kind of machinery, or it could be for a milk house. They have bigger lofts, and notice that the loft is ventilated with a mechanical ventilator on top. That's something you bought. You didn't build that. It's not like just cutting a louvered window to get ventilation. That's something that's available at the hardware store. It has lightning rods. It has a hay hood, which is a slight weather protection over the hay door, and an extremely large hay door for loading hay. Now, at this point, as we approach the 20th century, farms become more and more commercial. They raise more and more stock beyond what just the farm family will need. They don't just have one milk cow now, they might have 8 or 10. They may have commercial beef. They may be raising a much more diverse group of animals, goats, chickens, and so on, for commercial purposes beyond the farmer's need. And so they need a lot more feed for the winter, and that feed generally is hay. And that hay has to be kept dry and it has to be stored. You can't turn your chickens out into a hay field like you could cows. You can't turn goats out into a hay field unless you fenced it rather rigidly. And so they start to store hay in a serious way, and lofts become a much more significant piece of the barn. By the time we get to the 20th century, the loft is almost the whole barn. So I'm just going to show you some different examples of this. The gambrel roof comes along when they start to realize that they could get more room in the loft by building a double-pitched roof. And there are many different styles for it. But notice here, this is not a very big footprint for a barn, maybe 30 by 30. It's got a large, very tall wagon door. The reason the wagon door is tall is because now they're bringing wagons in with dry hay, loose hay, stacked as high as they can reach. So they've got to be able to get that wagon in the door, and then they've got to be able to pitch it up into the loft. So the loft area, the second floor, is quite large and expanded by the gambrel roof. Here's an even later example of the same thing. A hay door on one end, that little peak is the hay hood, and now we're starting to see concrete as foundations, what are called basements, even if they're not underground. Concrete starts to be made popular with the development of high-rise buildings in Chicago in the 1880s. And by high-rise, I mean 12 stories. And in Chicago was wet and swampy, and they wanted to build heavy buildings. So concrete, which has been around since the Romans, but not used in construction in Americas for very long, starts to become the technology for concrete gets better and better, and they build large flotation platforms upon which to build buildings. And those buildings in the south side of Chicago, which are built on a marsh, are basically floating. They're still there, they're still floating, and they're floating on a concrete slab. As concrete becomes more and more available in the late 19th century, farmers start to adapt to it, and most of the time make their own concrete, mix their own concrete. They get some creek gravel and some sand, and they buy bags of concrete, cement, and they make concrete is cement with aggregate in it, okay, with sand or gravel in it, and cement is the binder that hardens. So now they're starting to pour concrete walls, and even they can now buy concrete block machines, which make one concrete block at a time. And farmers buy them, and they set their sons to making concrete blocks so that they can put their barns up on concrete. The advantage of a barn on concrete is manure doesn't rot the bottom posts away, and they're much more durable if you have animals in the building. So this is a transition that happens. This is an extremely popular barn in 1910. There are really only two styles of barns. One is the English side entry barn, and one is what's known as a transverse barn. And what that means in lay language is you enter from the end. So it has, think of it as a center aisle from one end to the other, and you enter one end and drive out the other end. And so you see the main wagon door is on the end. There is actually a rather complicated diagram of how this transition happens. The thing that is, now I need your pointer, Mike. The thing I want you to look at is right there, the 4-crib barn. The white part is the barn room, the crib, and the darker part is the driveway through, okay? So you can see the farmer he's gone from 1 crib to 2 cribs to 3 cribs to 4. He can drive through north and south or east and west. And he goes, wait a minute, I don't need to be able to drive both ways. If I just drive one way, I can close off the other driveway and I'd have 6 cribs. And then he ends up with this, the transverse crib barn. You can drive from one end to the other. The beauty of this barn is as you need it to grow and get bigger, you just keep adding cribs onto the end of it, and the aisle gets longer and the barn gets longer, but you don't have to completely rebuild the barn. If you have an English barn and you drive in from the side and you want to add on to the end of it, you're getting farther and farther away from the driveway as you enlarge the barn, which just is impractical. So the transverse barn becomes the most popular barn in America after about 1880. Interestingly enough, if you're from an English heritage and your great-grandfather had an English barn and your grandfather had an English barn and your dad had an English barn, chances are you're going to build an English barn even today. Nevertheless, the Midwestern barn or the transverse barn is the most popular barn in the country. And you can see all the variations. You can add aisles to either side, and it becomes an extremely functional form, and we see it all over Indiana. Oop. I think I lost a slide. There we go. Here's another example of a transverse barn. There is this period of time where people are making their lofts larger, making their sidewall higher, and maintaining the so-called two-pitch or gable roof. And some of the gable roofs get really, really steep, and the lofts get quite large, but they never quite go to the gambrel style roof. Although most of them, like this one, are more typical, where they just get more loft room. And now you can see how incredibly large this barn is, and the loft space is quite large. This is another style of transverse barn. Usually you see these when the wings are added to the barn, not always, but typically this would have been, the center section would have been built first, and then the side wings would have been built later. And this transitions into a barn style that is colloquially called the Midwestern barn, or three-portal barn, where it has a center aisle down the middle and then 2 side aisles. And this barn now is all built at one time. This is the most popular barn style in America, the 3-portal barn. And now when you drive home, I bet you see one. we have very few Dutch barns in the Midwest. They're very rare, although there are variations on them that were brought here, probably most likely by German immigrants. But this barn actually originates in Holland. It has a very low side wall. It has a very steep gable roof. The additions you see came on later, but if you look at the main building, that's what this style barn looked like. It has a very unique timber frame construction style that is very specific to the Dutch barn, which is maybe one of the reasons that they didn't move off the East Coast. If you want to see them in any number, you have to pretty much go to New York State, and upstate New York, you'll see them. They're fairly common. Here's a pretty new one built in Indiana as a stable. And it's a slight variation with the wing on one side, but it's following the basic geometry of the Dutch barn. Also, the Dutch barn, interestingly, from the very first ones that are built, which probably date to the 14th or 15th century in Holland, always had a transverse entrance. They always entered from the end. It was the only sort of ancient historic barn style that did that. And the barns that we're quite familiar with in northern Indiana come out of the southeastern Pennsylvania cultural hearth, known as the Pennsylvania or German four-bay barn. Southern Indiana had a lot of German settlement around the Jasper area, but interestingly, you don't see this particular style of barn in southern Indiana very often. You see another German style barn called the bank barn or basement barn, which I'll show you some in a minute. But in northern Indiana, the migration of German settlement made these barns actually quite common. So if you drive across I-70 to the East Coast, you'll see lots of these. They're frequently ceramic or built out of brick and are quite large and quite elaborate. The forebay is the overhang that you see on this side. It's almost always on the south side, which is meant to shelter animals. And these two-story barns always had a low area for animals underneath, which was usually built of stone or later concrete, and the upper area was used for storage and work areas. And I have a few other examples of these as they developed in Indiana. This is an unsupported forebay, meaning there's no post or sidewall to support it. And you can see it's sagging a little. Here's another example of it, which is a supported forebay, which has a wall at one end to help support that overhang. Their little roof on the end is referred to as a pent roof, an unsupported roof. And the reason that they're not supported, they don't have posts, is because if you have wagons and horses and animals banging around against posts, next thing you know, the roof is on the ground. So they built them as cantilevered roofs. I don't know the origin of the word pent, but I can't say it without making the microphone pop. And here's a variation on that. The overhang is on the other side, so you can just barely see it. When they didn't have a hillside to build the Pennsylvania barn into, they built a hillside up to the barn. And that's actually quite common in the so-called bank barn configuration as well. And here's a very large example that is actually in Pennsylvania. And this is what's known as a supported forebay. You can see there are posts holding it up. It's quite large. So the bank barn is just that. It's just a barn built into a hill. The advantage is you can walk off the hill into the upper part, or you can go down below and let the animals come in the lower part. Bank barns usually have two access ways, one at the basement level and one at the upper level. They typically do not have stairways in between the floors. I'm not exactly sure why, but when the basement barns were built, which I'll show you in a minute, the only way up into the upper floor is through a stairway. But in these bank barns, you had to walk around to the upstairs doors to get in upstairs. There's another example of one with the so-called bridge built up to it. One way that you date barns is by whether or not they have any ventilation built into them. So in the scientific agricultural revolution, which happens in the 1870s and 80s and into the 20th century, it's noted that it comes from land-grant universities. So the development of University of Wisconsin, the University of Illinois, Purdue University, the so-called land-grant ag schools are the home of the scientific revolution in agriculture, the development of fertilizers, the development of different kinds of planting techniques, advances in mechanics, tractor development, and barn development, as we'll see. One of the things that is touted by this new science is that you need to ventilate barns. People are getting sick when they bring animals into their barns. The animals defecate all over the barn. The manure doesn't have a way to ventilate. The gas of methane gets dangerous. Barns actually explode or catch fire. And so the scientists at the universities say, well, you could open the window. So they create all kinds of ventilation, which translates into decorative additions to the barn as well. So you see painted louver types of additions. So that's one way to date barns, is that a barn that's well ventilated probably is built after 1880. Barns with big lofts, barns with lightning rods, which are also part of the scientific revolution. We forget how common fire was before air conditioning. It was very common for houses to burn down. Barns burnt down all the time, and fire was a real hazard. We know that the entire city of Chicago burned down in 1871, as did Boston. These are all improvements on barns. Notice that its configuration is a typical English barn with a side entrance wagon door. And here's another one, bank barn, very large bank barn with the side entrance, which for ramping works best. They usually don't ramp into the end of a barn, although it does happen. Another extremely large barn. And another way to date barns is if you look at the foundation of the barn, or the basement, as they're called when it's actually a room. If it's built out of stone, we know it's before concrete block. If it's built out of regular stone, that has been very carefully shaped by masons, it's usually a more expensive barn, but it would still predate 1880, 1890. And there are all kinds of decorative ways in which the stone ends up being used. Here's a really nice example of limestone being used in a bank barn. Probably in shapes that you could pretty much pick up in the field. Again, louvers. The scientific revolution ultimately ends up in what the barn called the Wisconsin dairy barn, which is actually not an entirely new shape or style. Notice the wagon doors on the side, like the English barn. And the gambrel roof, but these barns become very large. And they're specifically developed in at the University of Wisconsin for dairy farming. The windows on the main floor are indicative of stalls or milking areas. The upstairs windows are usually ventilation for the loft. And these had enormous hay storage areas and large ground floor areas for milking. By and large, cows were not kept in the barn, but they were brought in for milking. And here's another example. If you've ever been to French Lick, you probably drove right by this. And there's a whole set of roof nomenclature that is extant at this time. This is what's called a helmet roof. There's also a round version of this. This is kind of more like a Gothic arch, which is why it's referred to as a helmet. And notice here now the louver, the ventilation is in these little decorative dormers on the roof surface. all the mechanical ventilators on the top, and this is this barn is built, I believe, in the 1930s. And a very similar, smaller version. And now we're starting to see architectural refinement. So now you have dormers with slightly sloping artistic roofs on them. And really, all this really, and also decorated barns, which I'll get into in a second, but all this really means is sort of reinforces the notion farmers knew, and I suspect many of you grew up on farms, that the most important building on the farm was not the house, it was the barn. And a lot of money was put into barns, either their development and maintenance, but also the way they looked. And as it turns out, in the 20th century, barns tended to be located in more visible places on the farmstead, so that now people are driving cars, and there's traffic, there's tourism, there's all kinds of stuff, and barns are actually put on the road, obviously for the convenience of transportation, but also because they're the primary building on the barn. And if you see the house up front, you'll see the barn usually set out to one side, not behind the barn, not behind the house, and that's to give it visibility in the community. So in the ways that all of us express our wealth or lack of wealth by what we wear, what we drive, what we say, that's happening in the agricultural milieu as well. This is a circus barn in Peru, Indiana, built for elephants. And it's a Wisconsin dairy barn for elephants. And this barn's been being restored. There are two of them, and Indiana Barn Foundation had a tour there last fall and showcased these barns. So the basement barn, which I've talked about a little bit, is like a bank barn in terms of function, but there's no bank, there's no hill. So you have a masonry foundation, usually rubble stone, concrete block, ceramic tile, or later concrete. The animals live below, and the normal storage, hay storage, grain storage, and work areas are above. And this is the barn that I was saying, the only way you can get into the second floor is through a stairway from below. And they're fairly common, but not quite as handy as a bank barn. But if you don't have a hill, this is the alternative. And this is actually a German form that comes to us from the Holy Roman Empire in smaller form. This one's ceramic tile. And this was in the Warsaw area. This is factory-formed concrete block made to look like chip-faced limestone, but it's actually concrete. It's known colloquially as Warsaw block. And if you go to Warsaw, you'll see lots and lots of buildings constructed from that. So the tobacco barn, which is actually a fairly recent invention, for the most part in southern Indiana where tobacco was grown in the heyday of the tobacco market, people just took the barns that they already had and transformed them into tobacco barns by putting a bunch of poles through them and hanging tobacco in them. But they did build a specific style of barn as well. You see this red barn on the left, and I don't know how well you can see, but the slats in the side are open. They actually took the siding and nailed it into doors and hinged them so that they could open almost the entire side and ventilate the tobacco while it was drying. Here's another example. They're almost always very long and tall, sort of railroad car configuration. But as I said earlier, these English barn adaptations in southern Indiana were more commonly used as tobacco barns. And so these are actually somewhat more common than the intended design of the tobacco barn that I just showed you. And these are old barns. This is the interior of the one I just showed you. You can see the primary post is hand hewn, so it's probably 1870s, 1880s. And it's kind of a jumble woodwork in there because they've added all the poles for hanging the tobacco into the upper structure of the barn. Same example of that same type of barn. And lots of barns were decorated. We all know the mail pouch barn, which is kind of come and gone. Although I've noticed that people who have these on their barns are repainting them. And I don't think mail pouch is in the business anymore, but mail pouch tobacco had a whole crew of people who went all the way across the country, paid painters who would come to you, and mail pouch would pay you some stipend if you let them paint their logo on your barn. The only requirement was your barn had to be visible from the road. But there are lots of other kinds of decoration as well. I recently learned that people frequently ask, like, why are barns red? Well, first of all, they're not all red, but the red paint, I was told, comes from a linseed oil paint that originated in I can't remember if it was Sweden or Norway, but one of the northern European countries, and it was an extremely durable, chemically based paint that was brought by immigrants from that part of Europe, and it stuck, as they say, because it was very, very durable. By the way, if you have a barn and you want to repaint it, linseed oil-based paint is pretty much the only kind of paint that will really be of any use to you. Any other kind of paint won't last very long at all. And I don't know, there are several companies that make it, and they make it in various colors, but red is one of the common ones. And this striping on doors and windows, they're very unique. I'm just going to click through the examples I have. Bear with me. Well, I had a couple of other examples. I don't know what's going on here, Mike. I'm not getting my pictures up. Here we go. So, Indiana has, well, I believe Wisconsin has the most round barns in the country. Indiana is a close second. Illinois and Ohio and Iowa also have round barns, but they are pretty much a Midwestern phenomenon. The earliest ones we know of came from very early settlements of the Shakers, and were built in the 1860s. There's a very large stone round barn on the East Coast, built by the Shakers, and it was kind of a model. But as far as I can tell, the idea really didn't evolve beyond the Shakers' use. But in the scientific period that I was talking about, 1880s, 90s, 1910s, there's a great desire for greater agricultural efficiency. So how are we going to save the farmer steps during the day? How are we going to make feeding the cattle easier? How are we going to make the hay storage and retrieval lessen the workload and so on? And so the round barn is the solution that some people come up with as a way of making farming more efficient. And the basic idea was that the hay storage would be in the loft, and it would be accessible through a central shaft coming down into the middle of the barn, and you would have an aisle that went around the silo, if you will, and outside of that aisle, but inside the wall of the barn, would be your stalls. And so the farmer would come and take his hay over here and throw it in the stall, take his hay over here and throw it in the stall, and walk his way around. And in fact, it's fewer steps than walking up and down a long aisle, back and forth, to do the same thing. In most silage, when silos come into popularity around 1890, most silage is stored outside the barn, partly because it can be combustible, And so they don't want to burn the barn down. So the trip to get the silage and then bring the silage back in to feed is more complicated, whereas the round barns actually had silos right up through the middle of them. Not all of them, but many of them. So there are lots of styles of them. The names I have up here, Benton Steele and Horace Duncan, are two Hoosiers who were very effective design build team, if you will. And they evolved and perfected the unsupported true round barn roof. Okay, so it's a round, fully round walls, not paneled walls, and a roof that has no support in the middle. And they perfected a rafter connection that would enable this construction, and it was successful. Simultaneously, Franklin King from the University of Wisconsin came up with virtually the same solution. And they fought over it forever after. As a matter of fact, Benton Steele patented it at one point. And if he caught anybody using his design, he would sue them. He built barns for, I believe, the University of Illinois has a cluster of 3 barns. But Benton Steele and Horace Duncan traveled all over Indiana and the Midwest building barns, and they're very well documented in a book by John Hanot on Indiana round barns. It's called Around Indiana, and it's quite an interesting book. He traveled Indiana a couple of decades ago and documented all the round barns, and about 30% of the ones that he documented are now gone. So we actually have a really good survey. There's also a really good survey in Wisconsin, also by John Hanot, and he's working on a book of Illinois barns, round barns, at the same time. So actually, they're very well documented. Why I'm having trouble with this. Okay. This is a rather unique one, and I have it in here because it's really one of a kind. It's 4 stories high. It has an enormous loft, as you can see, and then it has a ventilator cone at the very top to let air out. It has an elevator in it, which is a little box, plywood box that you get in, and there's a pulley, and you pull the rope, and you pull yourself up and down. It was converted to raise chickens, I believe, at some point. Anyway, the Indiana Barn Foundation gave this family has returned to the farm, and some of the families living there again, and they are restoring this barn. And the Indiana Barn Foundation gave them a grant to rebuild the ramps. As you can see, there are 2 ramps that go into different floor levels. But it's quite a unique barn. These barns were very popular from the late 1880s through about 1920, and then they're virtually never built again. Now, there are a couple of people I know of in the state of Indiana who have built themselves round barns, but those are very recent. Here's another really nice example. And notice the improvements of modern agriculture, the ventilation circle, the large door, the high wall, the large loft area, the basement, all these things were incorporated into round barns as well as rectangular barns. And this one, I think this is on North 31, north of Indianapolis. Some of you seen this? It's notable because of the rooster on the roof, I guess. And this also has a concrete block, faux concrete block, if you will, basement on it.
Sir,
Yes.
they said it was hard to catch mice in one of these round barns.
And why was that? You didn't tell me I was going to have to be the straight man for. And here's another really beautiful example This one's been restored. And you can see the incorporation of concrete into the basement wall. Now, I want to talk about this. I started off talking about this transition in, first of all, the extent of timbering that happens in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century in this country, and the exploitation of that resource. But one of the reasons for instance, we know the cutting of the white pine forests in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan happens primarily after the fire of Chicago, and there was an enormous demand for building material. And even though buildings were specified to be made out of limestone or brick or to be fireproof, the inner structures of them and the roof systems were often made out of wood. And there's an enormous building boom post-1900 in this country. And so what we end up with is as a result of this supply and new designs for building houses, the balloon frame and then later the platform frame is also translated into barn construction, and we get what we call lumber framing or plank truss framing. And this is a diagram from the Loudon Machinery Company this is a design for a barn. You could buy this blueprint and build this barn. And this is, I think, 1917. Loudon Machinery Company produced Loudon barn plans. Yeah, there is also, at the same time, businesses like the Loudon Machinery Company that are providing, designing, inventing farm equipment and machinery, as well as buildings. And so you can, by 1920, if you need a stanchion for milking, you can go and buy one. You don't have to build it. You can buy ventilators for your barns, and you can buy all kinds of mechanical apparatus to help you remove manure and so on. And so barns become these sort of working factories run by internal combustion engines. And it's quite interesting. You start to see smokestacks and sometimes you'll see power plants on big barns where they're actually burning their own fuel in order to power their equipment and machinery, like any factory in the Industrial Revolution. But these companies, like Loudon, become the inventors of all these mechanical advantages. I believe it's Loudon that invents the hay track, which is a metal, first a wooden and then a metal hay track that goes up in the peak of the interior of the barn loft and has a pulley attached to it and then a hay hook attached to that. And it's used for dropping the hay hook onto your wagon of loose hay and hoisting it back up into the barn and hauling it through the barn. This mechanical advantage that's brought to us by these inventors ends up transforming the way barns are made and built, because hay storage becomes, first of all, it's a heck of a lot of work to go out and hand scythe hay or even mechanically cut hay and then load it by hand with you and your helpers onto a wagon and then drive it to the barn and then unload it all again. And if you're carrying it up into a second or third story building, you get the picture. It takes days. And if it rains, that's the end of it. So it's hastened by weather, and it's a very, very tedious task. So anything that made it mechanically easier to do was welcomed by farmers. And so there's this transition in barn style, partially because of the availability of dimensional lumber and the availability of mechanical advantages. More money in farming, the scientific revolution, which is, remember, all farmers are getting magazines and pamphlets, and every time they go to the co-op, there's another invention, and they're actually being bombarded with information about ways to improve their livelihood. And just like all businesses are, and companies like the James Company is publishing books called The James Way, which is the farmer's Bible for how to mechanize your farm, okay? So this eventually leads to the corporate farm that we see today, much less land in production, but much more efficient production, chemical production, if you will. It also leads to the demise of the barn as we know it, because now all you really need is a big metal shed to drive this equipment into. And so these barns become obsolete. But at the beginning of the 20th century, this is I don't know, a gift from the gods that you can suddenly mechanize your whole operation in a way that makes it so much more efficient. And remember, the way you make money in farming now is to have more and more and more crop. Whether it's more and more cows or more goats or more sheep, its size is making all the difference. And the 40-acre farm is pretty much a thing of the past. And if you can afford 2,000 to 100,000 acres, you can be a very wealthy, successful farmer. And this transition is what is taking farms to this commercial reality, like it or not. And you know, there's the downside, obviously. And so this barn transition is right in the middle of it. I'm starting to lose my faith in mechanical devices. Darn.
There we go.
Yeah, almost. Well, I didn't get to show you the one I wanted to, but so here's an example of what I was just showing you. And now I'm going to go backwards a little bit to show you what comes right before this. But now you're able to build a dimensional lumber standing truss, basically, that will support where the roof becomes the structure. And so you have no interior structure. Now, the thing that drove this was the invention of the hay track and the hay hook. Because if you can see up in the very top, there's a metal, for you it looks like a black line, but there's a hay track and a hay hook, and that travels from one end of the barn to the other, in order to take it out the end of the barn, drop it into the wagon, pick up the hay with the hook, pull it back up, take it back in and drop it in the barn, and so on and so on and so on. And in the old barn, because of the way timber framing was done, we had what are called tie beams that go from one side of the barn to the other through the loft. Well, they're in the way. So when you bring a hay hook down the length of the barn, you have to keep raising it back up to avoid the tie beams. And it's a pain, right? So this not only gives you more room, but it makes it mechanically easier to do. So there are a lot of examples right at the same time we're talking about in the scientific period of people trying to devise a structural solution to the barn that will make the hay hook easier to use. If you look at the one on the right, that little upside down T at the top is the hay track. And that framing solution shows, on the lower two stories, shows traditional timber framing, but on the third story shows an open frame that is braced from the side in order to leave that loft area open so that the mechanical advantage of the hay hook will function. And the ones on the left, the far left is a plan where they take out a tie beam through the middle in order to get that same clear passage. And then the other two are other somewhat inventive truss systems, braced systems that allow the center of the barn to be open, an open structure. And this is a traditional barn, a bent frame, timber frame barn, just to show you here, this is a tie beam, and the horizontal ones above that are tie beams, and their function is to hold the upright posts together and to keep the barn from tipping over or leaning in any direction. Well, those on the end wall, those are not an obstruction, but as you build those bents back through the barn, they become an obstruction. And so that is what this inventiveness is intended to get rid of. And there are several transition periods through the 1890s, 80s, 90s, and early 20th century where they're playing with old barns and reconfiguring their lofts in order to make these hay hooks work. And this is an example of where the tie beam is in the lower section, but the tie beams from the upper section have been taken out and bracing has been added. I know this is complicated if you don't have a construction head, but I'll do my best to explain. But I think you get the picture. What they're trying to do is open up the hayloft. And this was an earlier example. That rope hanging down, by the way, goes to the hay track. That's the way you pull the pulley back and forth. But this beam here, this tie beam there, is called a swing beam. And the advantage of it was it opened up the floor. So if you were bringing in hay in a wagon with a team of horses, and you couldn't drive all the way through the barn, you had to turn that wagon around, okay, to drive out. This barn is an English barn and it has doors on both sides, but on the far side, it's up off the ground because it's a bank barn, so you can't drive out into the air, right? So you have to turn around. So you come in on this side and you drive your wagon in here, you dump your hay, and then you turn your wagon around. Well, if you don't have a post here in the middle, you can turn the wagon. And that's the function of that. And you notice its shape is like the triangular shape of a truss to give it enough bearing to span that large area. So these problems have been slowly being solved as time goes by. But the swing beam is actually a very ancient solution to main floor space creation. And this little drawing shows another solution to opening up the loft so the hay track can function. And here is almost an exact example of that diagram. So this is an old barn, timber frame, hand-hewn. The tie beams, the horizontal beams on the main floor are still in place, but notice that above that, it's all done on diagonal bracing, those braces are called purlin braces. And they brace the rafter system away so you don't have to have posts and tie beams in the upper reaches of the barn. And here's a diagram of that solution. So these are the things that the ag companies, Loudon and James and so on, are all bringing out and making available to the farmers and to architects and builders. Sorry. I have some pictures that just don't want to show up. Well, anyway, I had an example of that for you. Shoot. Sorry, give me a second. All right, well, I'm just going to have to show you what I can show you. So one of the other solutions is, this is actually a tie beam, like I was talking about, that originally went all the way through the barn horizontally. And here they have actually truncated it or cut it off and put a diagonal brace on the top of it in order to leave the center of the loft free. And there you see it on the left, and down beyond it here. Those went all the way through the barn, and they've been cut off and diagonals have been added in order to open up that center. And you can see in the top the hay track in this barn. I had 3 or 4 good illustrations of that, but you'll have to use your imagination. I have 2 ways that I can advance these, and neither one of them wants to work. So this is an example of a plank frame loft construction, also where what used to be done with tree trunks is now being done with dimensional lumber, including a brace notch that is dovetailed into an upright beam. So these are all changes in construction technologies that happen alongside this so-called scientific advancement. Well, thank you, but that wasn't the end. Anyway, hopefully you'll get the picture. I apologize for machinery breakdown. I'm not quite sure I know what it was. But if anybody has any questions, the essential message is that all of this is in flux up until the point where it just kind of isn't, and these barns become obsolete for most purposes. The hope is that with the new market farmers and the small farmers who are growing for city markets and so on, they are actually they are looking for old farmsteads that have these barns on them because they can actually put them into use better than the large commercial farm can. But thank you anyway, and I'll be happy to answer questions if you have any.
Do you have any information on fruit orchard barns in southern Indiana?
No, I know that there were tomato barns. Most of the ones that I know about were basically just storage units. I don't know of any. Yeah, and there's a whole other lecture probably on corn cribs, grain storage barns, and, all of which have different design functions based on what they're trying to do, mostly store and dry products and keep them away from vermin for the most part. So, corn crib elaboration is quite a lovely thing. I have seen some fruit storage places in California in the Central Valley, but I don't really know anything about. I haven't seen them in Indiana, no.
There's a couple of, specifically north and south of Mitchell. There's a couple of old fruit barns.
And how were they used?
They had orchards and so peaches and apples.
And are they used as workspaces or as storage spaces or?
Temporary storage is how I assume.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
In your account of some of the barns, the new metal barns that are being built, are they not considered?
They're not considered in that count. I mean, those are barns, and I have a terrible time in the Barn Foundation convincing other board members that those are barns too. I was trained as a historic preservationist, so even though things are being built now, I can still see them in the ultimate plan for things we're going to save in the future. So we're probably going to be talking about all the different styles of metal barns. And
So that, under the definition of barn, what you're talking about is the older barns.
yeah, what we call heritage or historic barns. Yeah. And it used to be that, people say, well, that'd be pre-20th century or pre-World War II or whatever. But the fact is that most of the barns, as I said in the beginning, in the Midwest, and certainly in Indiana, have been built since the onset of the 20th century. So they're heritage barns, but they're not old-fashioned barns.
But according to all intents and purposes, in your eyes, or how are they just large sheds? Because they're all made out of metal?
Yeah, they tend to be, their objective is to be open span. So there's no support posts in them. They have very large metal and sometimes wood truss systems. So you can take a large tractor, wagon, or whatever, combine, and drive it in there and drive around and turn it around. And then you just partition the space according to your own need, which, makes perfect sense, really. They're just not wooden barns. Yeah. Yeah. And there are examples of two attached to each other through a corridor, and there are ones that have sheds built onto the sides of them. But yeah, you're right. They're awkward. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, thank you.